people know me. My name is John Regasta. I'm a historian here at the Robert A. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies. And it is my honor Thomas Jefferson to make several Jeffersonian because we wouldn't let you leave mountain without hearing something from Mr. Jefferson. So I will do that. Now, in preparing this conference, we heard, and we heard this morning, some objection to holding a conference about democracy in America when America has so often failed to abide by the principles that it has stated and so often to live up to the idea of democracy. That criticism is legitimate, criticism is long delayed, and we need to understand it as an opportunity to learn. We here at Monticello have some familiarity with the statement of broad and beautiful principles that people do not fully live up to. So we take that very seriously today. At the same time, I do think we have to take some care not to allow the legitimate criticism of our failures of principle to interfere with the principle itself. Abraham Lincoln talked about this in the run-up to the Civil War. And he said people recognized that America was not abiding by Jefferson's declaration that all men are created equal, and yet he said there's a danger that that failure will be used not simply as an opportunity to learn and do better, but as an attack on the principle itself. Lincoln wrote in 1859, "The principles of Jefferson are the definitions and axioms of free society, and yet they are denied and evaded with no small show of success. One dashingly calls them glittering generalities, another bluntly calls them self-evident lies, and others insidiously argue that they apply to superior races." Our inability to abide by that principle means the principle itself is not a legitimate moving principle, is what he was saying. Lincoln goes on, "These expressions are the vanguard, the miners, and the sappers of returning despotism." So our goal today is not to hide or ignore the failures, but really to understand this as an opportunity to renew our commitment and to continue the effort to achieve those principles. And the people who have joined us today at the Diplomatic Corps is devoting their lives to helping pursue those principles. The second thing I would point out in the Jeffersonian voice is to our diplomatic friends, appreciation, to our students, hope, and to all of those gathered, some remembrance of what Jefferson tells us about public service. He reminds us that the failure of public service, lethargy in public service, will be the forerunner of death to the public liberty. So we honor those who have served, and we hope we have in the room those who will serve in the future. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Ron, who I think is going to introduce our afternoon speaker.
Thank you, John. And it is a pleasure to be back here. And I think it's very wise to talk about the balance between policy and principle, because if you focus only on principle to the exclusion of what it is possible to do in the world, you actually breed cynicism, because you breed people who want impossibilities rather than to make progress, and therefore become extremely cynical when you don't have perfection. But cynicism gets you very little unless it's aligned with something else. Well, that's not my function today, but I did forget one comment this morning. Dr. Williams was talking, he mentioned that Portugal had become the word for orange in a number of languages. I just wanted to affirm, yes, that is also the word in both Arabic and Persian, for anybody who cares about such extraneous matters. Now, back to the subject at hand, which is our speaker, Ambassador Thomas Shannon, who is, by the way, also, I might add, the chairman of the Academy, so we're totally happy that he agreed to be with us today. He holds the rank of career ambassador, which does not mean much to most of you in the audience, means a great deal to those of us in the service because it is not only the highest rank, sort of equivalent to 4-star general, but it is much more rarely accorded than 4-star general rank. So that means a lot to us. He's been Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, been ambassador in Brazil. He was, for a time, acting Secretary of State when we had a bit of a gap. He has nearly 35 years in the Foreign Service, and he's there, he gave count, I couldn't remember what somebody asked me today, but he served 6 presidents and 11 secretaries of state. I think I'm at least one of them. And he's also been Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere, which is all of Latin America. So he is admirably poised both from expertise on Latin America and from senior experience in the department to reflect on this broad area of America's relations with Latin America. And without further ado, Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ron. A very kind introduction. It was said of Henry Kissinger that he didn't require an introduction, but always insisted on one. I did not insist on this, but thank you, Ron. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you. This has been a fantastic conference so far. Made the decision early this morning that I was going to drive down from Alexandria, Virginia, and get here for the start, and I'm glad I did so. Very grateful to the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and the Academy for hosting this. But very grateful for the presentations. Sarah, thank you for your presentation on President Monroe, on his home, and on his connection to Thomas Jefferson. I was very grateful that you highlighted the role of William and Mary in all of this. I'm a William and Mary alum, otherwise known as the alma mater of a nation. And being here within sight of Virginia's second best university. To Professor Walker, thank you for what I thought was a really remarkable presentation on the importance of Brazil. You have 2 former U.S. ambassadors to Brazil here, Ambassador Lanning and myself, and it's a country that is near and dear to our hearts, but which, curiously enough, in the American hierarchy, the State Department hierarchy, it was once the centerpiece of everything we did in the Americas, but with the Central American wars and then the drug wars in the Andes, somehow got displaced. And a bureau, the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs in the State Department, which had regularly run officers through Brazil, and in which everybody in that bureau spoke Portuguese, that slowly began to disappear. And it became the Spanish-speaking bureau. And so Donna and I were some of the rare Portuguese speakers in that bureau. That has changed now because of the way Brazil has reasserted itself in the world. But it shows you how the ebb and flow of U.S. policy and politics and our focus changes how our diplomats are raised, trained, educated, and presented to the world. So it was wonderful to also great Americans, and I believe they were importance of diplomacy and the kind of work that we do in our hemisphere and why it matters. My purpose today is to really talk about what comes next. But before I want to return to the Monroe Doctrine for a moment and its larger history, because there's a diplomacy behind it. I mean, it's an assertion of sorts, an assertion of purpose and intent and power. But there's a diplomacy behind it that is meaningful, and some of it was hinted at today. But I think it's worthwhile just to take a closer look at it. Diplomacy is sometimes called the world's second oldest profession. But whatever its precedence, it's certainly one of the most important. And I say that because it is the means by which nation states and in another time empires spoke to each other and speak to each other still. and how they try to find ways not only to understand interests and values, but to look for areas of cooperation, collaboration, and to look for ways to resolve conflict, and to do so in a way that doesn't generate great destruction. It is a profession which I would compare to being a poet, as opposed to being a novelist, instead of writing prose, because poetry is prose that has been put through a crucible and reduced to its most basic and utterance, and to explain why it is we do why we're doing what we're doing, and how we're trying to fashion either an understanding or redefine a dispute. The thing about the United States is that over time it produces great dividends at an alarming rate. And I once knew an American diplomat named Tony Gillespie, who used to refer to this as the virtuosi syndrome, which is that at key moments in American history, we seem to find this virtuosi, this person who is a virtuoso at doing this kind of diplomacy. And when people just ask me, what's the difference between the State Department and the Defense Department? I typically say, the Defense Department is like the NFL. Everybody has a playbook, everybody's a position player, everybody is in charge of 1 yard in front of them and 1 yard behind them. And they know exactly what they're supposed to do. And when everything works well, everything works well. But when things break down, it's a challenge, because the guard doesn't know what the tight end is supposed to do, the tight end doesn't know what the cornerback is supposed to do, et cetera, et cetera. The State Department is a lot more like New York street basketball. Of 5 guys or gals playing against each other, but it's really 10 people playing one-on-one. And everybody wants to shoot the ball, but everybody can make the shot. And so it becomes a challenge as they try to figure out, okay, who gets the ball when? And the reason I mention this is that President Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy, were virtuosos. They were remarkable diplomats. And it's not just because of where they were educated or what their family histories were. They loved first the revolutionary government and then the United States of America. And John Quincy Adams had an understanding of European politics, had an understanding of European personalities that I think was unique at the time, and allowed him to gauge and understand how these different principalities and empires were behaving and why they were behaving the way they were. And we would all be forgiven for not knowing about the discussion between British Foreign Secretary Canning and the American minister in London, Richard Rush. We will all be forgiven for not understanding the conversations between John Quincy Adams and Stanton Canning, the British Foreign Secretary's cousin, that laid the groundwork and the basis for the Monroe Doctrine. We will all be forgiven for not remembering the Congress of Rome, in which the Holy Alliance authorizes France to enter Spain, to put down a liberal constitutional government, and restore the full absolutist powers of Ferdinand VII. But this is the spark that convinces the British that they cannot allow absolutist imperial powers to return to the New World. Because after the Napoleonic Wars, as the British looked for a way to capture and trap France and not allow it to upend the apartheid alliance, an array of countries that they had fought alongside, whose sole purpose was to block France at every turn. But with the emergence of the Holy Alliance and the Russian Tsar Alexander I's determination that the Holy Alliance was all about supporting divinely inspired imperial leadership, this opened a space for France to return to the fold, so to speak, and to enter Spain in order to crush a liberal constitutional government and return Ferdinand VII to power. This horrified the British, but there was nothing they could do about it on the continent. So they decided they were going to do something about it in the New World. And they were going to look for a way to ensure that whatever happened in Spain, that neither Ferdinand VII or the French were going to be able to reassert their power and authority in the New World. And as Ron noted, Ambassador Newman noted, the Foreign Secretary Canning approached the United States in an effort to get a joint commitment in which the United States and Great Britain would use their naval power. And U.S. naval power was not insignificant at that time, especially along the Western Atlantic, extending from Florida down to the River Plate. That's where the U.S. Navy patrolled. That's where it sailed at that time. So the British could do the North Atlantic, the United States could do the South Atlantic. And the whole thing got out of port. Secondly, they were not going to be allowed to enter port in the New World. And the Americans were captivated by this idea, interested in it. Monroe even went to his friend Thomas Jefferson to ask his views about this. Jefferson thought this was a very good idea. But there were differences about how to manage the British, because we had just recognized the independent republics of South America, and we were trying to get the British to do the same. And the British were reluctant to do that. They preferred to allow this to take place over time and not be done immediately. But as the U.S. and Great Britain began to circle each other, trying to determine how best to manage this, John Quincy Adams saw an opportunity, working with President Monroe, to fashion a statement that would have three broad principles. One is the principle of non-colonization, which, as you can tell from the name, is designed to effectively put Europe on notice that the Americas were no longer to be the subject of European colonization, which is that the United States would not participate in wars of European powers where its interests were not directly involved. And the third is what they call the dictum of hands-off, which is really the assertion that the states of the New World, that the new independent republics of the Americas, were independent because it did not want to entangle itself, did not want to entangle itself, find itself being drawn by the British conflict, either in the continent or on the high seas. But it was a risky move because the U.S. went first. Actually, the British went first in a memorandum to a French ambassador, but they did not do this publicly. The United States was the first one to do this publicly, and then the British backed it up. And it was a remarkable move, a remarkable diplomatic maneuver. But think about this for a second. If you step away from 1823 and go back to 1819, John Quincy Adams negotiates with Spain a transcontinental treaty, which no longer control Florida, and they knew it, and the British knew it, and the British had been busy arming and organizing Seminole Indians and fugitive slaves that lived in Florida, and leading a revolt against Spanish authorities there. And these revolts were put down not by the British, but by Andrew Jackson, who entered Florida from Tennessee, captured Pensacola and what was then known as Western Florida, and then marched across the state to capture Eastern Florida, arrested the British officers who had organized the Seminoles, and executed them, just to underscore the point of who was in charge. And at this moment, John Quincy Adams realized that there was an opportunity to speak to the Spanish, who would recognize they could no longer control Florida, and negotiate a deal whereby the United States got Florida. This was one of President Monroe's principal foreign policy purposes, because he recognized that Florida was the missing piece in our eastern seaboard state structure. And he was looking for a way to chop off a European empire in North America. But what Adams was able to do with this treaty is that he linked it to the Louisiana Purchase, which, although was valid in terms of a deal between France and the United States had never been recognized in Europe itself. And what the Transcontinental Treaty did is recognize the United States. But then Adams did something even more remarkable. He took out a pen, because the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase was never well defined. He took out a pen, drew up the Mississippi, across to the Rocky Mountains, and out to Oregon, and told the Spanish, this will be our territory. That meant the Spaniards got Texas. Sorry, there are any Texans here. But Adams was prepared to do this because with the Transcontinental Treaty, he effectively drew a line all the way to the Pacific and established U.S. sovereignty all the way to the Pacific, opening up continental expansion. This was all done by diplomacy. It was all done by, over time, the United States taking advantage of the desperation of Spain, and then once having locked that down, working with the British, seeing a convergence of interests, but looking for ways not to be ensnared by the British, and then establishing parallel lines of work with the British that allowed the United States not only to open a space for continental expansion, but then limit the ability of the Russians to come down from Alaska, limit the capacity of the Spanish to move up along the Pacific coast, and at the same time, begin support of revolutionary movements and independent states in Latin America and the Caribbean that were going to eventually squeeze Spain out of the entire hemisphere. And so, from the point of view of a diplomat, from the point of view of someone trying to understand how the United States marched through this continent, this was brilliant. And in fact, Samuel Fladd Bemis, who is one of our greatest diplomatic historians, at one point wrote, "The transcontinental treaty with Spain was the greatest diplomatic victory won by a single individual in the history of the United States." And I would have to argue that Monroe Doctrine was probably the greatest single conceptual advance by two individuals, Monroe and John Quincy Adams, that the United States has seen in its foreign policy. And this leads me to a bigger point, which is that the pamphlet we have here refers to the Monroe Doctrine as being an assertion of primacy in Latin America since 1823. I know it's oftentimes used that, and in fact, when I was a young diplomat kind of coming up in Central America and South America, I ran into many people who saw it as part of a hegemonic project designed to assert our authority over countries that had never asked for it. But when the Monroe Doctrine was first asserted, it was not understood as a statement of U.S. primacy. Instead, it was understood in Latin America and the Caribbean as a statement of solidarity, as a recognition that the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, were distinct from Europe. They were distinct from the Old World, and that they were going to defend themselves from the Old World. Because the Old World, in those terms and at that time, was, in Madison's phrase, despotic. It was absolutist, it was tied to divine right of kings, and American republics were something different and distinct. And whatever their future might be and whatever sins they might commit, they were republics focused on liberty and on fashioning governments that were in some fashion reflective of the communities that they represented. And as we consider the advancement of diplomacy within the Americas, within this context of the New World taking special place, what the Monroe Doctrine does is begin to hint at very important principles that then emerge over time in the development of the Pan-American movement, the Pan-American Union, and then the Organization of American States, which mirror, to a certain extent, the principles laid out in the Monroe Doctrine. And those are non-intervention, self-determination of peoples, peaceful resolution of disputes, and free commerce among free nations. And these become the mechanism whereby the United States, working with its partners in the hemisphere, really beginning in the 1880s, start to lay down the juridical basis for the inter-American system, which leads ultimately to the creation of the Organization of American States. But as this is done, they begin to focus also on issues of security. And what's worth noting is that because of World War II, and because of the entrance of fascism into South America, especially Brazil and Argentina, and to a certain extent Mexico, the United States began vigorous diplomacy in the region, focusing on anti-fascism. So the first real national security mentality kind of deposited on our hemisphere begins with a concern about imperial despotism. But by the 1940s, 100 and some years later, it's concerned about fascism. And only then does it concern itself with communism, only in the aftermath of World War II. But what happens because of World War II and because of the importance of South America to not just the U.S., but the Allied war effort. And remember, for those of you who have forgotten, when the Japanese conquer the rubber plantations of Southeast Asia, we had no access to rubber. So where do we get it from? We get it from Brazil. And we did a deal with the Brazilians whereby they sent tens of thousands of young men from northeastern Brazil into the Amazon to become rubber tappers and to produce the rubber that created all of the gaskets, all of the wheels, all of the treads, everything that the Allied forces needed in order to continue their fight both in Europe and in the Pacific. But maybe more importantly, the Brazilians allowed the United States to build air bases in northeastern Brazil, which were a critical component in what was known as Operation Trampoline, which was the movement of men and materiel across the Atlantic into North Africa in order to fight the German army in North Africa. And so this hemisphere commits itself to an Allied war effort, with one or two exceptions. That's quite remarkable given the fact that the outcome of the war was not predetermined, that it still had to be fought. But in the process of doing so, the United States and its partners in the region began to sketch out and lay down what they considered to be the security needs and concerns of the hemisphere and how best to deal with them. And in 1947, in the Organization of American States, the United States and its partners negotiated the Inter-American Treaty on Reciprocal Assistance, otherwise known as the Rio Treaty or the Rio Pact, which is a collective security agreement. In other words, it's not the United States asserting security primacy in the region. It's the region saying that we have a collective security requirement and that we all have to be responsive to. And this, the Rio Treaty was negotiated in 1947. The NATO Treaty is negotiated in 1949. And in fact, the NATO Treaty's concept of collective security comes from the Inter-American Treaty. In other words, it's the thinking of not just Americans, but Brazilians, Argentines, Uruguayans, Colombians, Mexicans, that allows a conceptual basis that then gets transplanted into Northern Europe as we create the transatlantic alliance. And so all of this, to a certain extent, flows from the Monroe Doctrine, flows from the kinds of ideas that President Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, presented to the world. So as we think about this today, as we think about what is the meaning, this conference has chosen to focus on democracy. A good thing to focus on. Because we are at a moment in which we can assert solidarity throughout the Americas as we all struggle to understand how our democratic institutions and processes can respond to the kinds of demands our citizens are making today and how our political institutions can adapt to the dramatic rate of change that we are seeing in our social and economic lives. And the rise of populism, the decline of political parties, the kinds of political leaders we are seeing today are the product of a moment in time in which our societies have raced far ahead of our political institutions and the capacity and capability of our political institutions to manage this change. And so the question is, what do we do about this? And I would like to refer back to another inter-American agreement, which is the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which was negotiated across the transition from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration, and across the transition from the 20th century to the 21st century, and which was first presented to the Organization of American States in Costa Rica in June of 2001, was not accepted, was considered to be incomplete, and therefore was renegotiated across the summer of 2001 and presented to a special General Assembly of the Organization of American States on September 11th, 2001 in Lima, Peru. And again, you're forgiven if you didn't catch this, but while aircraft were flying into the Twin Towers and flying into the Pentagon, and while a fourth aircraft was circling, almost certainly headed for our Congress, Secretary Colin Powell was having breakfast with Peruvian President Alejandro Toledo and was about to go to the conference center where we were going to discuss and eventually approve the Inter-American Democratic Charter. By the time Secretary Powell came out of that breakfast, he said, "We are at war." But he did not go to the airport. And thank God the airplane had to be refueled. He knew that it was going to take an hour or so to get his aircraft ready. So he went to the conference center and he gave an incredible speech, impromptu, in which he said that the United States was under attack, but not only the United States, that the attacks that were taking place were an attack against democracy, an attack against open society, and that the best response possible from the countries of the Americas, from all those present in that conference room, would be to approve the Inter-American Democratic Charter and also invoke the Rio Treaty. And that's what happened. The Democratic Charter was approved unanimously, and with the help of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the president of Brazil, who called up Hugo Chavez and said, "You got to do this." The countries of the hemisphere activated the Rio Pact before our NATO allies did, just a few hours before. But and that underscores, first of all, the connectivity over time of diplomacy, and how the good acts of good diplomats and good political leaders ripple through time. But the reason I wanted to talk about, especially the Democratic Charter, is that it addresses many of the issues that were raised in the panel earlier today, which is the efficacy of democracy in our hemisphere and its future, and the extent to which democracy creates the possibility and the opportunity to generate prosperity. And the Democratic Charter is 22 years old now, but it contains within it some truly remarkable things. First, the first substantive article of the Charter reads, "The peoples of the Americas have a right to democracy." This was a radical statement at the time, because democracy was never understood as a right. It was understood as a political system that was made up of different kinds of rights: freedom of association, freedom of belief, freedom of speech, and others. But to say that a political construct was a right was a dramatic statement, but it reflected a increasingly deeply held belief in the Americas that this is a region that had tried every other form of government. It had tried military government, it had tried totalitarian government, communist government, other forms of authoritarian government, and it had not been able to generate either the political stability and coherence or the resources necessary to address the poverty, the inequality, and the social exclusion that have defined so much of our hemisphere, in some instances our own country included. And so there was a radical commitment to democracy, which no other regional association in the world had made at that point. But the second part of that first article was that the governments of the Americas have an obligation to promote and defend democracy. In other words, the peoples have a right, but the governments have an obligation. And that creates huge space for us as we work in our hemisphere with our partners to try to define what this right means, but also how governments can promote and defend democracy. But the second article says that democracy is essential to the political, social, and economic development of the peoples of the Americas. Now think about that for a minute. They're saying that the authoritarian development of China, the authoritarian development of Pinochet, the communist development of any number of countries are not adequate for the kind of political, economic, and social development that the peoples of the Americas demand. It has to be democratic development. It has to be development that responds to the needs and interests of peoples. The importance of peoples is that it's not a single entity. It's a recognition of the diversity, the ethnic and racial diversity, but especially the presence of indigenous peoples. And in fact, and here's a little known fact, you're hearing it first. When I was the principal negotiator on the U.S. side of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and when we did this, the phrase, the peoples of the Americas have a right to democracy. The State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor was opposed to peoples, and it was opposed to the right to democracy. And we had a considerable fight to get past their concerns, which were not invalid, but for me they were politically obtuse. But just to show you how bureaucracies work, when it became apparent that I was not going to back down, my colleagues in the Office of the Legal Advisor called their colleagues in the Legal Advisor's office in Ottawa, and who then called their colleagues in the Legal Advisor's office in El Salvador, who then called their colleagues in different parts of the Caribbean, trying to build a backfire that I was going to confront in a negotiation. And so I can remember sitting across the table, and I'd gotten a hint that this was coming. And I remember sitting across the table in the Bolivar room of the Organization of American States in Washington, and listening to my Canadian colleagues, to my Salvadoran colleagues, to my Caribbean colleagues, suddenly starting to raise objections about peoples, and more importantly, the right to democracy. And so I let them all speak their piece, and I said, thank you very much for your views. If this is where this negotiating platform is going, the United States is withdrawing itself from the negotiations. And I'm going to go outside and give a press conference in which I say that the representatives of Canada, El Salvador, and different Caribbean nations do not believe their people have a right to democracy. That is over. But I'm telling you this because this was a radical step forward on the part of the Americas. And not just conceptually, but in many ways it was flipping a paradigm. Our paradigm, when we talk about democracy, is about free and fair elections, it's about constitutional order and process, it's about peaceful transfer of power, all of which are important. But what our partners in the region were saying, And what we ended up articulating with them was that the goal was not democratic governance. The goal was not democratic institutions. Those were means. The goal was not to create a democratic government, it was to create a democratic society. And what a democratic society is a society not only in which people have a voice in determining their national destiny, not only a voice in which people can help choose their leaders and fashion national direction, but it's a political space in which people can claim the right to determine their individual destiny. In other words, they have access to the education, to the health care, to the security necessary to realize their potential, to achieve what our founding fathers would call the pursuit of happiness. And for me, this is how we need to be thinking about and approaching the challenges that we face in our hemisphere today. You heard from three very experienced diplomats about the challenges we face as we work across the hemisphere and try to promote democracy, fight corruption, advance transparency, and promote prosperity through trade and commerce. And of the challenges we faced, and when we've gotten it wrong or haven't been able to advance things sufficiently quickly for people to feel that they have actually been heard and that an impact has been had. And this, from my point of view, is the magic of the moment. Because if we understand that what we're doing is not attempting to limit how people behave through democratic institutionality, but actually trying to look for ways to step into a very different kind of society, and that we're prepared to listen to all aspects of our society, all aspects of our electorate and voters in order to accomplish it, it creates an energy and an electricity which I think we can use to our advantage. And this kind of brings me to a point that I think is worth aiming at, because what I've described for you is what kind of the context, almost the emotional environment in which we're trying to conduct our diplomacy. But as I have worked through these issues over time, and as I have tried to find ways to articulate them within the U.S. government, and look for ways in which the U.S. government can work with our partners in the hemisphere to achieve these goals, I came up with what I call political rules to live by. And I'm going to inflict them on you now. They're pretty simple. The first is that the enemy is not Russia, it's not China, it's not Iran, it's not Turkey. Those are adversaries. The enemy is the status quo. The enemy is the assumption that we can somehow hold this particular space in time and keep it there, a period that we dominate. My argument is that we have the capability to run with anybody, and therefore we should not be afraid of competition, and we should not be afraid of the race. And that for us to be meaningful in our hemisphere, we have to make ourselves relevant to our partners every day. And we have to understand that in this world of diplomacy, polygamy is considered a good thing. We are all about free love. You cannot insist on single partners. You have to be prepared to work alongside other partners. Because especially in a hemisphere that's globalizing, how are they not going to deal with the second largest economy in the world? The question is, how do they do it? And we can help shape that. But we have to have it in our head that democracy, if it is seen as a retardant, if it is seen as a conservative form of government that is all about protecting entrenched classes, will fail. But if it's seen as something that can promote social transformation, but in a peaceful way, it will be very attractive. The second point is that all politics are social. And what I mean by that is they're all about inequality. They're all about poverty. They're all about discontinuity and exclusiveness. They're all about lack of access to resources. And if we understand that, they're not ideological anymore. If we understand this, if we understand that what we're trying to do is blow the doors off economies, create the education and the economic growth required to allow people to have access to goods that we can advance. The third rule is that values matter, and that those values, especially our commitment to peaceful resolution of disputes, to peaceful social change, to human rights, and what we call fundamental liberties, are attractive. And the extent to which we step away from them, or the extent to which we diminish them in the way in which we engage in our hemisphere, we harm ourselves, and we undermine our partners. The fourth point is that as important as nation states are, and as crucial as they are right now for the way in which countries communicate with each other, the truth of the matter is societies and cultures will drive politics and define relations in the future. And I saw this across my career, but maybe most dramatically when I was in Brazil. In 2012, President Obama visited Brazil. And if I had walked into the Brazilian Foreign Ministry and asked them, what is it that you want from President Obama's visit to Brazil, they would have told me U.S. support for a permanent seat on the Security Council for Brazil. If I would have walked outside and grabbed the first Brazilian I saw and said, what do you want from President Obama's visit to Brazil, that person would have said, a visa waiver program. In other words, they want to get into the United States without having to get a visa. And curiously enough, if I had then gone to Florida and walked into the first hotel or restaurant I saw and said, what do you think the United States should do when President Obama goes to Brazil? They would have said, a visa waiver program. Because at that time, Brazilians were traveling to the United States in record numbers. We were doing 4,000 visas a day in our embassy and our consulates in Brazil at $160 a pop. We were like a big cat company. We were just generating money for U.S. Treasury. But more importantly, each Brazilian family that went to the United States was spending on average $20,000. From hotels to theme parks to restaurants to buying everything they could get their hands on. And so I just saw this as this evidence that there's this churn, this tremendous social pressure. And it's not just about travel. It's about education. It's about getting to universities. It's about healthcare. It's about how faith communities relate to each other. You probably don't know this right now, but the interconnectivity between evangelical churches in the United States and Brazil is off the charts. And they have a level of communication and understanding with each other that we in the U.S. government are envious of. And then, the fifth point, and this is a little tricky, but it's important to understand, which is that the deeper we get into this century, legitimacy will be determined by outcome. And what I mean by this is not the ends justify the means. It's that people aren't stupid. And they are not going to continue to go and vote each election. They're not going to accept political leadership that cannot deliver results. They require results. And therefore, we need to understand democracy not as a process, but as the generator of outcomes, and outcomes that are meaningful for people. And, in the 19th century, even within the run-up to the Civil War, through the 1830s and 40s, and this is another point worth making, President Monroe and John Quincy Adams, as they were fashioning their policies towards Latin republics and the Monroe Doctrine, were very careful not only not to be drawn into European conflicts, but not to be drawn into conflicts in the Americas. And John Quincy Adams' rationale for that is that any conflict in the Caribbean, especially in Cuba or beyond, was going to involve slaves. And he was fearful that a war that the United States would commit itself to in Latin America, the Caribbean, would generate conflict in the United States because of the difference between slaveholding states and non-slaveholding states. Think about that for a minute. He was thinking 40 years ahead. He understood what was coming, and he didn't want to provoke it. And from my point of view, that's quite remarkable. But at that particular time in the United States, the democracy of America had a potentiality and an expectation about it, which was remarkable. People felt they were part of a project that could drive them to a very different place in life. That there was social mobility and economic opportunity. And although there was obviously great risk, which actually comes a-cropping with the Civil War, there was kind of not just kind of a blindness to the risk. And in many ways today, we're in kind of a reverse place because we seem to be fearful of our democracy, fearful of our politics, fearful of what's happening around us. But we seem to have lost this sense of potentiality, this sense of expectation that we can do something great, that we can fundamentally change not only how our political institutions respond to the demands of our society, but how this works throughout the hemisphere, and how it does so in a way that shows that democracy can produce social and economic transformation, and it can adapt to social and economic change that is running about as fast as it possibly can. And I would argue that if we can find a way with our partners in the hemisphere to return this sense of adventuresomeness and this sense of potentiality and expectedness, we can get things done, and we can get things done in a way that not only does us credit, but reflects back on great Americans like President Monroe and John Quincy Adams. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, so we can take a few questions. And having spent you in the thought, I would yeah, let me get this gentleman here. Hey, do you wait for the light?
Turn it on. Now, we've listened to all the speakers here, and all of you are on the sort of the same theme as far as America's participation with the Central and South American countries and what we can do to help things. But I'm still not, I still don't understand how we can do all these lofty things that you're talking about, which are great things to try to focus on or to go to. But how can we possibly even start when most of these countries are ruled by drug lords, where from the policeman on the street corner to the prime minister in the capital are on the take or afraid of the drug lords, and their policies that they have are going to be responsive to them and not the people of the country. How can we do this?
It's a great question. And I guess I would, first of all, begin by arguing that doesn't define all the countries in our hemisphere. It describes, maybe 4 or 5, which is still significant. And that obviously as, because crime is globalized the way economies are globalized, they share best practices, just as businesses share best practices. And they become very good at operating within certain kinds of environments. But I would make a couple points. The explosion of transnational crime in our hemisphere is largely because Americans can't get enough cocaine. And no, this is what drives the money and the weapons. There are other forms of corruption that are not tied to this, but the wealth that sits beneath some of these criminal organizations, and it comes not only from the United States, it also comes from Europe, because the cocaine being produced in Peru and Bolivia is going out through Brazil into Europe. The cocaine being produced in Colombia is going up the isthmus into the United States. So we have things we have to do, but at the same time, in larger countries, in the Brazils and the Argentinas and the Chiles, and even I would argue in the Colombias, we have an opportunity to fashion a form of engagement with them, which is built around solidarity, but is also about us trying to achieve mutual benefits, because these countries have things to offer us as well as we have things to offer them. And we can start, and we have started to a certain extent with trade and investment, but we can move beyond that. As we look for ways to move our supply chains into more secure environments, many of these supply chains can go into our hemisphere. If we can find ways to work with American businesses to try to convince them to operate within our hemisphere. I also think that we need to do much more in terms of educational exchanges. And some countries in the region, Brazil and Chile in particular, have been sending students to the United States over time in ways that are hugely beneficial to American universities and the communities in which universities exist, but that we need to do much more, and we need to look for ways to build centers of not only academic excellence, but tie those to scientific, technological, innovative excellence, and then manufacturing and industrial processes, and that the countries of the Americas have the capability of managing that and working with us. In fact, Ambassador Reineck was talking about steel production in Pennsylvania. I don't know what the numbers are now, but when I was in Brazil, the largest steel producer in the United States was a Brazilian company, which had moved a bunch of its operations to the U.S. So they were employing Americans, but it was a Brazilian company, because they were in many ways producing at a level of kind of technological skill that few of our founders could match at that time. So, I mean, your question is an expansive one, and it has to be broken down into pieces. The corruption piece, which was another question that was asked earlier, is a really tough one, because these things are embedded in cultures. They have to be kind of pulled out by the people themselves. We can't do that alone. But we can at least create a vision that allows people to understand what the possibilities are.
Next question. We got a couple more minutes. We got one in the back. Wait for the mic.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I actually come from university, not William & I'm from JMU, and it's been exciting to hear you. And I'm a history professor, and your history was wonderful. I'm going to ask you the question that has always bothered me about the Monroe Doctrine, if you don't mind. Sure. And that is, could you explain to me what power that doctrine has in terms of Latin Americans? I understand it as something that, with Monroe and issues. Is there an attempt that Latin Americans, I understand in 1823, most of them are busy with just getting out of wars of independence, but I think I'm intrigued by this question about solidarity versus, for me, what I see is kind of the beginning of U.S. ambition in the Western Hemisphere. So is there some way you could explain how Latin Americans saw that at the time and anything about that? That's like been my key mystery of the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much. It's a great question. And JMU is a great school. Didn't mean to insult anybody. Thank you very much for being here. But when the Monroe Doctrine was first articulated, as I mentioned, it was not understood in the hemisphere as an assertion of American primacy. It really was understood as an assertion of American solidarity. And in 1906, then Secretary of State Helu becomes the first Secretary of State to travel to Latin America. And he travels first to Rio to a Pan-American Union meeting. And he's greeted with great fanfare by the Brazilians. And the Brazilian foreign minister changes the name of the palace that the event is being held in to the Palacio Monroe. So that gave you an idea how in 1906 the Brazilians understood it. But that said, the interventions that defined the Taft and the Woodrow Wilson, to a certain extent, Calvin Coolidge's presidency, really soured the lands. And then they begin to wonder what's going on. And they don't necessarily see this in terms of the Monroe Doctrine, because although some, as Ambassador Gutierrez noted, the Roosevelt corollary did cause the United States to intervene in Nicaragua, in the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, largely around customs and payment of debt issues. But there were larger and more involved interventions that deeply upset and worried Latin Americans. And in fact, when President Roosevelt is elected, he appoints Cordell Hull as his Secretary of State. And Hull goes to a Pan-American Union meeting in Montevideo. And the Argentines show up in Montevideo prepared to blow up the Pan-American Union. They said they've had it with U.S. behavior, they've had it with interventions. The United States is not a partner in the region, it's only a threat, and therefore they were done with it. But this was the beginning of the good neighbor policy. And the Argentine foreign minister was a gentleman by the name of Saavedra de Lamas. And Hull goes to see him at the Argentine embassy in Montevideo. And they work out a deal whereby effectively, as kind of the first step towards a great neighbor policy, or good neighbor policy, the United States makes commitments to begin pulling its troops out of the countries in which it intervened, instead focuses the region on commerce and on free commerce, which is what the Argentines needed and wanted at the time. And this opens a space for President Roosevelt to get done when he needed to get done during World War II. But when the troops in the Americas realized that our purpose was really to block communist or leftist leaders from holding power in the Dominican Republic and instead imposing leadership that was more favorable to us, they felt that they had been used. And because of this, regional countries will not commit troops to a UN peacekeeping operation or to any operation that the Americans are involved in until the Haiti crisis of the Bush administration. So it kind of goes up and down over time depending on how our relationships are with these countries and to what extent we have confidence and clarity on what our purpose is.
I think just about that. You gotta ask.
We could find ourselves in which, especially within the UN, the General Assembly decides to revolt against the Security Council and articulate that you guys know
UN might well off the Security Council. I'm much less optimistic that they would have any ability to solve the problems beyond that. But you've certainly opened a third big issue. Maybe that's for another maybe not for our conference, but it's the responsibility of leaders to explain to publics the larger, more complicated definitions of the world rather than the bumper sticker approaches to solutions that wall off most of that more complicated thinking. So I think we've had a great conference and we've certainly left with things to keep us either thoughtful, depressed, or entertained, depending on your view. I now need to close with some thanks. First, to our great hosts at Thomas Jefferson Foundation, to John, Augusta, to Leslie, Kathleen, also to my own staff, Maria, Katie, Sienna, without whom all this just wouldn't work. This is, I think, John, you have the count, so this is now our 14th year of doing this. I feel like we've gone from one strength to another, and absolutely great. I've been impressed also with the questions. So I thank you, the audience, for being with us, for being attentive. Remarkably, you don't look worn out. We'll let you go before you have a chance to test that. And thank you for being with us. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to the audiovisual team as well. The technology worked today. That's great. So thank all of you very much, and thank you for coming.
Thank you guys for your help.
Absolutely.
Thank you.